was nothing. And then there was life.
The PS1 rocked, huh? For a total newcomer to the console market, Sony really knocked it out of the park and gave us a system with a ton of classics. The PlayStation's life and 90s gaming as a whole was well and truly a golden era for gaming, wouldn't you agree? Man, they simply don't make them like that anymore, do they? Well, it seems like, yes they do. Throwback mini consoles are all the rage after all, with the PS1 Classic following in the footsteps of the NES and Super Nintendo mini systems. And aside from that, have you seen the number of nostalgic cash-ins that have come out of this generation? Yeah, we have Bubsy on one side of the spectrum, but you can play Final Fantasy VII and Parappa the Rapper on your PS4 now. But what I think really started this off was the Crash Bandicoot N. Sane trilogy. This wasn't just a quick port or a lazy retexture, no. This package was the original 3 Naughty Dog Crash titles rebuilt from the ground up and brought into the modern day properly. And people loved it. It's still in the UK game sales charts more than a year after it came out, and some people would even go so far as to say this is the definitive way to play Crash Bandicoot. However, from the moment that dropped in June of last year and gave the old games a new lease of life, fans began to ask when the same treatment was going to be given to Insomniac's initial entries of the Spyro the Dragon series. After all, the two franchises had always been linked, with demos for one series being hidden within releases for the other and a pair of admittedly dreadful crossovers on the GBA, so it seemed like only a matter of time before Activision would do the same thing for the Purple Dragon that they had for the Bandicoot. And surely enough, after a strange marketing campaign consisting of a set of teasing images from a stranger named Falcon McBob, some Twitter banter, a flamethrower drone and Snoop Dogg, Activision and Toys for Bob's Spyro Reignited trilogy is finally here for the PS4 and Xbox One. I have to admit that even with my black curmudgeonly heart, I was pretty excited for this set of remasters. After all, I grew up playing Spyro 2 and 3 with my brother, but let it be known that I had some gripes with the Crash N. Sane trilogy, mainly in the lighting and control department. Whoever decided Crash's hitbox should be rounded on the bottom is an absolute reprobate, and it's a miracle that they haven't had an unfortunate incident involving a bathtub and a toaster. In short, I would even now rather play the 90s version of the Crash games than the remakes, with the noted exception of the first one. Don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean they're bad, but it's going to take a lot to really impress me. So, is the Reignited trilogy a true treasure trove, or does this dragon egg crack under the pressure? Why don't we glide on in and find out? Don't look at me like that, I'll make all the dragon puns I want. It just occurred to me that as I'm essentially the only YouTuber who didn't spend 3 videos covering the classic Spyro trilogy in the lead up to Reignited's release, it would be somewhat arrogant of me to start rambling at you for 20 minutes and assume that you know exactly what I'm talking about the whole video, so before we begin properly, let's do a quick recap to bring everyone up to speed. Spyro the Dragon was developed by Insomniac Games and published by Universal Interactive Studios for the PlayStation in 1998 and sees you control a young purple dragon named Spyro on his quest to free the other dragons across 6 worlds, gather treasure and defeat Nasty Nork and his minions. What made it special compared to other PS1 releases of the time was the vast expansive levels and the way you could see so far across them without affecting the game's performance thanks to technical trickery I won't go into here. Spyro has the ability to breathe fire to dispatch strong enemies from wooden chests, a charge move for armored enemies vases and getting around quicker, and a glide to traverse large distances once you've got a high enough starting point. That last one is something you'll need as every stage is chock full of secrets and hundreds of gems for you to collect that all tally to 100% to give you a nice completionist dopamine rush. Over the next 2 years, 2 sequels would be released for the PlayStation as well, both adding even more to the winning formula. Spyro 2 gave more variety to the level's themes, added in a few little diversions from the main formula, gave a little more direction so things felt less disjointed, and polished the story up some more, but felt like it was cut short by the final world, and Spyro 3 added even more new minigames and 4 extra playable characters with their own side missions at the cost of a lot of its focus and some of said minigames being a bit rubbish, not to mention the clear rush nature. Regardless, all 3 titles are truly stellar examples in the platforming genre, beloved by PlayStation fans, and if you haven't given them a try, then you definitely should. Whew. Now that we've got through that, we can dive straight into Spyro Reignited, right? Well, from the beginning there's a little bit of a roadblock. Until a 13.5GB patch is finished downloading, we can only dive into Spyro 1, and this got me worried. Disregarding the idea that once the PSN and Xbox Live servers are shut down, half the content I bought will be locked off from me, you know what other Activision title required an absolutely gigantic day 1 patch to unlock the majority of it? Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5, a release so rushed they got it out into shops the day before their license to use the Tony Hawk name and likeness expired, and they had to burn the discs with little more than a glorified demo on them. Given that Spyro had already been delayed once, The fact that it was possible this game wasn't even finished before it was printed didn't bode well for me. Thankfully, my quibbles were quelled quite quickly once I actually got started on Spyro 1. Oops, hang on, just gotta sign this release form for my kidneys. Seriously though, even from exploring the Artisan's homeworld alone, this is already immediately scoring points over Insane. Spyro's movement is weighted yet bouncy and snappy, and the charge is closer to Spyro 2 and 3 than 1 as it doesn't have that weird drifty feel to it. It feels mostly the same, but it's a lot snappier than it was before. The newer control scheme carries through across all 3 games, although in Spyro 1 the hover move is still absent. But now you get the roll in Spyro 2 and 3! The roll that nobody ever used. Oh, that's not good enough for you? Well, here's something you'll definitely appreciate. Now, from the beginning in each adventure, a simple click of the left analog stick activates Sparks' gem locating abilities, and this was a particularly welcome addition. No more going around and around in circles looking for that one gem you missed. This is exactly the kind of thing I want as a small quality of life improvement that has a major impact on raising the accessibility and reducing elements that would be frustrating. However, while this is definitely a big improvement to the Spyro experience, I can't help but feel that Reignited has missed a few opportunities to take it further. Yeti boxing, escorting the alchemist, and a few other of the more notorious sections that sucked almost 20 years ago suck here too and haven't properly been fixed, which would be forgivable if it weren't for the fact that certain other segments have actually been made worse. Gulp's cannons in Spyro 2 can now somehow read your mind and know where you're going to charge to before you get there. The mechanical dragons in Year of the Dragon's Fireworks Factory are more hostile than they ever were before, and the timing on when mushrooms pop up in Sheila's area of Spooky Swamp makes anything the alchemist threw at you seem trivial.
Ow! I went boom again.
Yeah, we know you went boom again. We got that the first 20 times! Another element that sometimes got frustrating was the camera. It's definitely appreciated that I can now aim this in any direction I want with the right analog stick, a feature that's already making it difficult to return to the originals to capture footage since they use the shoulder buttons only, and it's so much easier to look around and spot your next objective most of the time. Most of the time is an important operator in that sentence, however. When it's good, and when it's bad, it's really bad. The speedway stages and charging underwater made such a chore because of how close it's pulled in, and when you have to aim up or down, you can't gauge what's ahead of you at all. Mushroom Speedway's bonus mission was infuriating thanks to how friendly the camera wanted to get with Hunter's plane. Even standard charging was slightly too close for comfort. Okay for the most part, but whenever I had to charge through chests or vases, the screen would be full of particle effects, and this led me to use that move far less than I would have on the PS1. And yet, I didn't mind taking a more scenic stroll around, because thankfully Reignited gave me tons of good stuff to feast your eyes on. Let's start by talking about the environment and their absolute beauty. Whether it's the lush greenery of Midday Gardens, the frozen tundra of Crystal Glacier, the arid deserts of Clifftown, or the smoky dusk of Breeze Harbor, the color scheme remains vibrant without being excessively bright or abrasive. While a bit more subdued than Insomniac's efforts, it's breathtaking nonetheless, and with an art style that's full of depth and details while remaining simplistic and chunky, you know I can dig it. If we want to talk specifics, I was also a major fan of the way blades of grass sway as you move through them and singe when you breathe flames, and the fresh elements that have been added to the levels here, such as Dark Hollow now being a library. There's a lot more minor embellishments like this, but it never impacts the atmosphere, yet displays a huge amount of respect for not only the original's aesthetic, but creating its own consistent and appealing vibe. In the vast majority of cases, these worlds are more beautiful than ever, though there are a few instances where I wasn't pleased with certain alterations. They certainly dropped the ball on Icy Peak from Spyro 3 in particular and removed all the surreal pastel hues to make it just another ice level. But regardless of if the environments have seen an upgrade, I can't necessarily say the same thing about the characters. Many of them have had radical redesigns, and I have no idea why Toys for Bob felt the need to change them to this extent. Aside from the flappy Muppet mouths and chunky polygons inherent to the limitations of the PS1, there wasn't anything majorly wrong with the way that characters actually look. I understand for Spyro 1 that they wanted to give each of the dragons more personality and distinguish them from each other, but why did Norks have to be made so Clash of Clans? Did Bartholomew have to be given a smartphone? Why are the Enchanted Towers artists now all hipsters? Did the dancing skeleton in Skelos Badlands really have to do the floss? Anyway, for others like Elora, I understand some people feel that bringing them up to date with modern standards necessitates starting from the ground up, but on the contrary, these fawns from Fracture Hills borrow heavily from their 32-bit counterparts and are far more appealing, so I wouldn't agree there. Now, that's not to say every redesign is bad. Some of the new takes on old characters are genuinely fantastic. Ripto exudes much more of an actual threat now, Sheila's Mountain Ranger outfit tells us more about who she is, and Buzz is completely disgusting, far fouler than ever before. But then, when you're trying to bring a game up to date while staying faithful to what made Spyro special, why is this the part that T4B decided to go hog wild on? I mean, let's examine Hunter as a prime example, since he's probably the most egregious case of this overzealous redesigning, and he's practically unrecognizable. Outside of the DeviantArt Angstfest Misstep Legend of Spyro sub-series, Hunter's design has remained mostly consistent across the entire course of the series. Check him out in A Hero's Tale here. There was work done to add detail, yes, but despite that, he's still distinctly, well, Hunter. Meanwhile, this dude bro doesn't look, talk, or act like the Hunter I grew up with at all. It's hard to explain, but he carries himself in this weird, aloof, condescending manner, and whenever he speaks, he sounds like, you know Bam Margera in Tony Hawk's Underground 2? You ever notice that it clearly isn't how he actually talks? Like, it is him, but it's like he's doing a bad impression of himself or something. Like he needs to turn up the Bamitude, so people can tell it's him, and it's super cringy. Yeah, that's what Hunter's voice is like now, and it's terrible. In fact, voice acting in general is somewhat of a concern across various spots in the Reignited trilogy. Tom Kenny does a fantastic job as Spyro, especially in the first game, seeing as he never did that one before. Our player character sounds less like a Mountain Dew chugging, Doritos munching, X Games watching gremlin, and is more likable and much friendlier, mostly because he isn't so whiny and nasal.
Where's Nasty Nork? I'll torch him! Where's Nasty Nork? I'll torch him!
There are certain parts where the delivery gets lost. Some subtleties to Spyro's intonation when he goes confronting Ripto in the older take makes it seem a lot more serious than in the Reignited trilogy.
Yup. If you want to test that power crystal, why don't you try it on me? I'll stand still, I promise.
Yup. If you want to test that power crystal, why don't you try it on me? I'll stand still, I promise.
This seems to be a recurring trait in Spyro 2 particularly. Ripto doesn't come across anywhere near as chaotic as before, and now seems like a bumbling wannabe, in direct contrast with his updated design. That's a point too. What's the deal with returning actors only reprising some of their roles? Greg Berger had so many roles in Spyro 2, yet now all he does is Ripto, Crush, and Gulp. Robbie Daymond takes the role of Hunter now? They got Andre Soliuzo back specifically to do Sparks, but the role of Bartholomew's been given to Richard Tatum instead. I can understand changing the voices where the old voice actors weren't available, that's one thing. But if you've gone to the effort of calling these people in, surely you'd want to use them for what they've already proven themselves at. At least Stuart Copeland was involved with the remixed music, although only in an overseeing role. Initially I was a little concerned with whether or not he would be on board, as I kinda disliked the changes to Crash Insane Trilogy's music, but I'm happy to admit that Stefan Vankov's rearrangements managed to breathe a great amount of new life into the soundtrack, especially with the dynamic mix that's been added. If you stop moving for a while, the instrumentation grows thinner and more minimal as you plan your next move. If you charge, a galloping drum track is overlaid on the melody. There's even subtle variations in the arrangement for if you're outside or inside, and it does so much to immerse you into the wonderful world of Spyro. But you know what? If you don't like it, that's fine too, as you can easily toggle back on the original tracks in the options menu, just as they sounded in the late 90s. This definitely doesn't feel like a late 90s release anymore though. Spyro's been bumped up 6 times over its old 240p resolution to run at 1440p on the PS4 Pro at 30 frames per second. Pretty respectable for a console release, if not the 4K 60 that I'd prefer on PC. Though occasionally you may have a little bit of stutter here and there, it's almost unnoticeable in recordings and hardly a deal breaker. Mind you, the whole experience seems a lot smoother than it probably is due to the copious amounts of motion blur. While I personally think it's fine when you're playing, any screenshots taken of the game in motion tend to look terrible as a direct result of this, and I can imagine that if you suffer from motion sickness, this would be a major issue. Unfortunately, if that's the case, you're out of luck because it's impossible to turn this off. and I have to wonder whether we could reach a 4K rendering resolution or 60fps standard if it weren't for the egregious amounts of post-processing. Additionally, I ran into a few glitches here and there, mostly in Spyro 3, though one Spyro 2 glitch forced me to restart my PS4 after the most annoying mission in that game. But I imagine these will be patched out in the coming months. All in all, Spyro Reignited expands upon Insomniac's 3 PS1 titles and does a great job revamping them for a modern audience. The graphics and art style are charming and bright, the controls are smooth as butter, and the sound design is as good as ever. While I'm not yet sure if these would replace the originals in my heart, and if I could truly see this as the de facto way to experience Spyro, if you've never played this series before, then this would be a great place to start. However, there is one caveat to that. If you've played the classic Spyro titles before and you didn't like them for some reason, this compilation won't make you reconsider that. Faithfulness and an immense amount of respect for the source material are at the forefront, but Spyro 1 feels just as disjointed and aimless as ever, Spyro 2 still tapers off towards its final act, and Spyro 3 is just as loaded to the brim with minigames as it was before. This is Spyro, warts and all, and even if those warts are covered in makeup, they're there underneath regardless, but your mileage may vary as to whether they're a problem. But no game's perfect, of course, and to the vast majority, I would say that this is definitely a solid platforming experience for modern systems, and a great addition to your collection.